How did states govern themselves after the Revolution? Shortly after the start of the Revolutionary War in 1775, many new states began to write their own constitutions. In this lesson, we will review the following: understanding key terms, the basic ideas on which new governments were founded, the major differences between the Massachusetts Constitution and the Constitution of other states. Terms to understand: legislative supremacy. Parliamentary sovereignty, also called parliamentary supremacy or legislative supremacy, is a concept of constitutional law of some parliamentary democracies. It holds that the legislative body has absolute sovereignty and is supreme over all government institutions, including executive or judicial bodies. Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the principle that the authority of a state and its government are created and sustained by the consent of the people through their elected representatives, who is the source of all political power. Petition, a formal written request, typically one signed by many people appealing to authority with respect to a particular cause. Veto, a constitutional right to reject decision or proposal made by lawmaking body. The legislature would have a veto over appointments to key posts. Other terms: natural rights. These rights are for the people. This is the right of life, liberty, and property. Our government is required to protect these rights. Higher law. Each state's constitution was higher law that everybody had to obey. Social contract. An implicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits. For example, sacrificing some individual freedom for state protection. Theories of social contract became popular in 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries among the theorists such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau as means of explaining the origin of government and the obligations of subjects. Other continued terms. Representation. Each state found that the legislature must be made up of elected representatives. These representatives are chosen by the people. Voting. Separation of powers. All state and federal governments have some separation of power. The government's power was divided into three different branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. Checks and balances. With checks and balances, each branch of government can limit the power of others. This way, no branch is overpowered, including with legislative supremacy. Basic ideas about government and state constitutions. These ideas include inherent rights, government by the people, and separation of power. Inherent rights are the rights to be free human beings. Government by the people means that power lies with the people to elect their government. Separation of power divides the government into three different branches. This is based on previous government experience. State constitutions include the following basic ideas to protect and promote the common good: natural rights and higher law, social contract, popular sovereignty, representation, separation of powers, checks and balances, and legislative supremacy. Major differences between the Massachusetts Constitution and other state constitutions. The main difference between these two constitutions is the way they provide their power. Instead of using legislative supremacy, the Massachusetts Constitution divides power through its three branches evenly. Also, Massachusetts legislature was elected by the people. Ideas for discussion. How was power distributed in most states? The power was distributed through legislative supremacy. As you can see in the picture, the legislative branch is supreme over all other institutions. Ideas for discussion. What might be advantages and disadvantages of giving more power to the legislative branch? Advantages. It could uphold rule of law. It is democratically elected. Disadvantages. Lengthy process. The legislative process, it takes a long time to go through both houses. Ideas for discussion continued. How is the distribution of power different in Massachusetts? The Massachusetts government did not use legislative supremacy. The Massachusetts kept its branches of government equal because they were elected by the people. This was done to avoid having a monarchy. How did Massachusetts Constitution differ from constitutions of other states? It distributed power more evenly, and the people expected the governor to protect their interests. Ideas for discussion continued. What might be some advantages and disadvantages of Massachusetts' division of power? Advantages: no branch is more powerful than others, and they cannot lead to a monarchy. Disadvantages: no branch can solve an issue without others agreeing. Also, it can lead to government shutdowns or decline in economy. Importance of Virginia Declaration of Rights. Virginia's Declaration of Rights included a Bill of Rights, which included power coming from the citizens. All men are naturally free and have basic rights. Trial by jury, protection of self-incrimination, protection of cruel and unusual punishments, freedom of press, and freedom of religion. Rights protected by other states. Rights included in other states' constitution included right for men to vote with qualifications, free and frequent elections, freedom of speech and press, right to petition, no taxation without representation.
Previous video, I talked about how each state has a different approach when it comes to constitutionalism. So let's look at some states in terms of how they approach constitutionalism and how their governments are going to be organized. The first state to actually have a constitution after the Declaration of Independence was Virginia. So let's look at what the Virginia Constitution created. First of all, it's going to create what's known as a provincial Congress, and it assumed full legislative powers. And from this, from the provisional Congress, we're going to have chosen the governor, his councils, and his senior justices. So we're basically going to have a governorships that are beholden to the legislative branch. The governor has very little patronage power, and in fact cannot even veto legislation. And the lower house is going to be annually elected, whereas the upper house of the Virginia Congress is going to be elected every 4 years. Now, in steps a founding father that honestly has not really gotten much credit, and his name is George Mason. Yeah, we got George Mason University, but really, I mean, George Mason is not a household name like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. But nonetheless, Mason is going to draft what we would call a Bill of Rights. And he says that we need to have a Bill of Rights before we can approve this Constitution. And so basically what it is it's a definition of people's rights that are going to be guaranteed by a government. And this is going to set a precedent that exists today. By 1784, all 13 states are going to have provisions within their Constitution and Bill of Rights that are going to guarantee things like religious liberty, the freedom of the press, and trial by jury. We can all thank George Mason for that. Another state that we're going to see a radically different way of doing things is going to be in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians feared placing sovereignty solely in the hands of the government rather than the citizens. So you're going to have a one-house legislature, and you're going to have a plural executive. You're not going to have just one governor. You're going to have multiple governors, one of which is going to preside over them all and be called the president. They're going to have annual elections. They're going to, and the legislative sessions in Pennsylvania are going to be public, and representatives also are going to have term limits. For example, Pennsylvania representatives cannot serve more than 4 years in every 7. Now, unfortunately, this system really never works. It's too wieldy, it's too complicated, and the needs of the war are going to complicate the system even more, to the point that it really never takes off the ground. But it kind of shows you a different way of doing things. In Massachusetts, you have a different constitution, and one that perhaps you and I would recognize a little bit more. For example, it's got a Bill of Rights, just like Virginia. It has a bicameral legislature, although it's elected annually annually, unlike in Virginia, and its governor is actually elected by the people, and he had veto power. And however, the legislature could override this veto with a supermajority of votes, the 2/3 majorities in both houses. So this these three constitutions shows us how differently each state is going to interpret the colonial experience. One's going to be distrustful of government authority in a single man, whereas the other one's a little bit more comfortable with it. And then, of course, you're going to have Pennsylvania, that's the oddball of them all.